Valrie Grant, geospatial strategist and consultant, is the founder and chair of Geotech Vision in Jamaica. I'm so proud, we are so privileged to have you on the show. The main reason I was interested is because I recently became aware of something called the UN GGIM PSN. So we're here basically in this episode to unpack what those letters mean and to understand more actually about a really great podcaster in our industry, in you, Valrie. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Wilfred, for having me.
Okay, so I think what we can do is get straight into translating this string of letters. So what is the UN GGIM PSN?
Wow, it's a mouthful. So it's the United Nations Global Geospatial Information Management Private Sector Network. And really what that is, it's a network of this global expert group that was formed in 2016. So it was at the sixth session of the UN expert group that this network was formed. And I think it was formed because of the recognition that governments can't do it alone. And this whole thing requires a huge ecosystem. And so in 2016, the 5 years into the UN GGIM being in existence, the expert group discussed a proposal which was endorsed and effectively established both the UNGGIM private sector network and the academic network at that point in time. And it basically means that there is stronger public-private partnerships in order for new data sources and technologies to be harnessed. And that was what happened.
Yeah, okay. So it's amazing because my whole career has been in the private sector. So forgive me for habitually almost thinking of geospatial data and the services on top of that and all the products as coming from the private network. So I guess it makes me wonder what kinds of individuals and organizations are represented by the PSN. Was there a deliberate process of outreach and selection to certain private sector organizations, or was it that you announced it and waited for people to come to you? Tell us more about the formation.
Okay, so I know that it was more organic than that. So even before a grouping was formed, there were certain private sector companies that was instrumental in the process and was being there as observers. And they may have been there as observers because they were advising a particular body. I know I certainly used to attend the meetings since 2014 because of the fact that I served in a committee that was responsible for strengthening geospatial information management in the Caribbean. That was a project, a spatial data infrastructure project that was out of the UNGGIM Americas group, sorry, that was led by Mexico at the time. And so I served in that steering committee. So I was part of that mechanism. And so when the thought of having, I think, different groupings recognized that they were using private sector resource in advisory capacity and academic resources like that. And so then it was Sanjay Kumar at the time from Geospatial Media, and
in India, right? I know
right.
him. Yeah,
And
he's done
so
some great surveys.
I think
Yeah.
right, and Sanjay really pushed, I believe, that proposal as well. Sanjay is good at helping people to collaborate, and I think he was very instrumental in that process, the way I remember it. And we got together, and there were some founding members. Geotech Vision was one of those founding members. So that is why I was part of that private sector network.
There we go.
Or continues to still be a part of the private sector network.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It sounds like networking pays off, and it's a nice message for all of us to make sure we establish connections in the industry. And you never know where things will develop.
But just to say, because I don't think I answered the other part of your question. So participation in the network is free. and it's open globally to all private organizations and related associations, really. They just need to be willing to contribute to expand the global policies and capabilities and act in harmony with what the agenda for the UN GGIM committee of expert is to be supportive. So it's not a network that you go to sell. It's about building this global community, and let us act in order to really help our planet. Let us act in support of what those SDGs are, or whatever else may come, but make sure that we create that kind of impact. So it is helping the whole.
Okay, yeah, that's an important part of understanding that it's not just a way to access a global market for products and services. Yeah. Okay, and that, I guess there's a couple of directions I'd like to go from there. So as I was saying before we started recording, unintentionally, you're actually the second person on this podcast who's a member of this private sector network. The previous episode was with Nadine Alamay, who's made a number of contributions to the industry through establishing standards. And that basically assists, for example, private sector organizations to collaborate more easily. So I guess that reinforces the theme that you mentioned of participation being about spreading the message and the standards and the way of working together that this organization propels. We could do, I think, also with a bit of detail on what the Global Geospatial Information Management organization is, or board, or community of experts. I think that's what it's called. Excuse me for not being able not being familiar with the usual terminology of the UN. I haven't dealt with this sort of stuff before. So that is something separate to the PSN. Could we have a bit of detail on that?
Yeah, so the UN Global Geospatial Information Management Committee of Experts is really made up of different countries. And so the countries that are part of UN, they are the ones that make up this committee of experts. And in order to have some semblance of leadership, then it's broken down based on the different regions. So there is the Americas grouping, which is the grouping that I would fall in. There is the grouping for Asia Pacific. There is also the African grouping. There is Europe. And so there are these different subgrouping that are there. And the different groupings, the 6 regional groupings, then have their structures, and they also have their meetings in the different regions. But we meet in New York once per year, usually in August, as a global grouping, to speak about what progress has been made over the past year, and not just what progress has been made, but also to set the agenda for things for the next year, to report on what that is. And in between those meetings, there's a lot of working groups that is happening depending on what those agendas is. So maybe it's a working group that deals with climate action. Maybe it's a working group that deals with disaster risk management or resilience. And one of the groups that, has been instrumental is a high-level grouping on what is called the UN IGIF, and that is the Integrated Geospatial Information Framework, which is a framework that has been developed to really help countries to help accelerate their adoption, let's say, of geospatial information management at the national level.
Okay, so I'm not going to try to recite that long name, but was that developed by the UN GGIM? That's an example of an output to assess geospatial operations at a country level.
Absolutely. Okay. So that's one key initiative, one key framework that was developed by the UNGGIM in helping countries, and it's being used as a mechanism to assist countries in getting to have their national geospatial arrangements in order. This particular framework have several strategic pathways, and not just it has implementation guides and action plans. So it gives you a mechanism so that you can systematically follow, depending on your country. It's not prescriptive, but based on your priorities of your country, you can use these frameworks as a guide and help you to get to that output. So that's one tangible example of something that has been done. There are other frameworks that are there. There are frameworks that on geostatistical framework, for example, where the geospatial community is working to collaborate more closely with the statistical community. And that is something that helps the two communities to see how they can bridge that gap and how GIS or geospatial information and statistical information can be easier integrated. So that's another example of another output. There are things to do with land management. So that's what this committee works towards, getting these frameworks out and getting these documentation. So in the past, it was about, okay, producing these frameworks. Since this year, I have seen where there is a shift towards not just producing frameworks, but towards making sure that you can action the frameworks towards the actual implementation.
Wow, I love this. It's been a really interesting journey doing this podcast because, I've basically since 2011, I've worked at a number of engineering companies on some decent sized infrastructure projects across 5 countries. So there's a particular view and application of geospatial there, whereas the pipeline or the highway. But it's really exciting and really interesting to hear about a totally different way to work in geospatial. It just makes me, because I feel like a way that I can put this, because we have an audience, is that those that may have spent 10 plus years in geospatial in the way that I have, this is another world that may be exciting and interesting. Maybe that's a question to ask as well. Are there many people involved in this committee, either as an expert on this panel of experts or in the PSN, that are from an engineering consultancy?
So the expert group, the main grouping, is made up of governments, just like most of the other UN bodies. So from the private sector grouping, as mentioned before, it's open to companies that are in the geospatial arena, and some of them do have engineering backgrounds. So maybe some of them, like you have indicated, just doesn't know that this exists. I'm shocked each day that whenever I do a presentation or somebody introduced and said, oh, she represents the PSN at the global level, or the president of the Americas grouping for the PSN, then somebody says, what is the PSN? So maybe we ought to do more in terms of publicizing what that is. And I'm happy that you're helping us to do that through this particular podcast as well, so that persons can become a little bit more aware as to how it works. Because our vision is really to have a active participation of the representatives for mutual benefit, to make sure. And one of the things that I often say is that as a community, we sometimes spend too much time talking to ourselves. So if we can get additional persons involved from an engineering perspective, who is really consumers of the information that we are generating, then that would be amazing as well. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I think we have dispatched the second question, which was the mission of the organization. To me, it was that, at least until very recently, the sole focus has been coming up with frameworks to assist governments to benefit for their populations to benefit from what geospatial and geostatistics can offer in terms of land management, of this all manner of how a government functions to protect and ensure the longevity and the health of the people. Is there anything else to say about the mission of the organization?
Well, I think I would only say that the UNGGIM in general, with all of the attendant pieces, whether that be the private sector network and the academic network, or the UN societies, because there's also a UN societies, geospatial societies, really strive to set the agenda for the development of global geospatial information to promote and to address global challenges So that is essentially why it's there. We recognize that, these issues do not have boundaries. They do not stop at our national borders. And so we have to be working together. And so the private sector network specifically is there to really facilitate a direct connection and communication between private sector members and the member states to achieve success in addressing the challenges that they want. So this ongoing dialogue and assisting. Clearly, private sector sometimes is outpacing in terms of research and development, and so helping the governments to do some of these things is really critical and will help to address the global challenges that we're speaking about. I'll give you an example. So, and I'll speak to something in the Caribbean because that's one of the places that we do quite a bit. So I spoke about the Integrated Geospatial Information Framework, the UN Integrated Geospatial Information Framework. One of the things that we did in the Caribbean in 2023 was to have a workshop with member states across the Caribbean on that particular framework. And in that, it was led by the UN GGIM Americas and a grouping called the Caribbean Geospatial Development Initiative, CARIGEO. Again, a lot of acronyms. However, the private sector was very integral in that world. So the private sector network also sits on the Caribbean Geospatial Development Initiative. And so they partnered to make sure that that workshop could take place in St. Lucia. And it was a successful workshop in the sense that there were 13 Caribbean countries that were there. I think over 20 persons were present. It was members of not just the geospatial community, but the statistical community. And one of the countries went back and they requested a national workshop through UNECLAC, and that was then held in Trinidad and Tobago. And these countries are working on their national geospatial information arrangement because some of these countries are at different stages in their development. So that's one example of how the grouping is working to kind of leave no one behind and take everyone with them. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we're on to an example of a notable impact from the work of this committee of experts and the PSN. Great. So I guess you said that there's been a recent shift from just developing, maintaining, updating these frameworks to measuring how effective they are. Am I characterizing that correctly? Or
well, not
was
just
it ensuring
measuring,
they could be implemented?
Implemented, yes.
Okay.
So it's accelerating the implementation because we've found over the period that a lot of documentation has been created. There has been these frameworks, but are they reaching, are they being used the way they're supposed to be used? Are they having the effect, as you talk about measuring impact? Are they having the effect? Are countries using it to really advance their national geospatial information management arrangements in different areas? And so this is something that is being addressed. Some countries are still far behind in terms of, where they are using, and I'll give something like disaster management and using geospatial to support comprehensive disaster management. Why is this the case? Can there be a way to help accelerate that kind of implementation? I think of something coming out of the UN SIDS-4 meeting that was held in Antigua earlier this year. And out of that came what is called the Antigua and Barbuda Agenda for SIDS. And part of that is the whole matter of during the next 10 years, how do we make sure that SIDS are more resilient? How can geospatial help to support that? And so another example is that out of that, we recently had a consultation again in Antigua on this whole matter of the SIDS Global Data Hub, but not just the SIDS Global Data Hub, but also on strengthening the implementation of the UN IGIF indices. And these consultations are not just being done in the Caribbean. So I gave the example of the Caribbean. There was a similar consultation that was held in Fiji. They're happening all over the world where SIDS are, because these small island developing states, there is this recognition that they're more vulnerable and has been characterized as such. So how do we make sure that we can help them to adapt and or to be more resilient, and what role does geospatial information play in terms of underpinning that whole resilience?
As I said before, I've had this career of, I think since 2011, I have been on all these engineering projects. It's such a breath of fresh air, Valrie, to hear you talking at this totally different scale, a countrywide or a planet-wide scale, of how a large, powerful organization is synthesizing the best in terms of frameworks for helping populations to thrive. And I tell you, I don't know, it's so welcome to hear that there's another way for me to apply effort to benefit people, but still within the geospatial industry. You're making me wonder how I could get involved and what extra things in terms of training, qualifications I might need to have before I can begin to become the kind of strategist and consultant that you are.
Well, we all have something to offer, so that's the first thing. So, in terms of getting involved in the PSN, it's pretty simple. As I said, it's free and open to all private sector organizations in our field. And so you simply go through the UNGGIMPSN.org, and then there is a membership button that is there, and you express your interest, and it will be reviewed by the board, and that board and the executive committee will essentially do a vote on it, review the information to make sure that there's nothing untoward, just kind of doing your due diligence. And then you are a member. And how much you contribute in terms, it's voluntary. So, there are some persons who are very active and you see them playing a role in so many different things. And there are others who strategically play different roles in the background. And there are others who just kind of play to the strengths that they have. So it depends. I'm sure that there is so much that you could contribute. So we encourage you to check it out and be part of the network.
I'll take the opportunity, Valrie, to ask a question that relates to an accumulation of experience about a phenomenon I've been observing in a few countries in this career that I've had.
Okay.
And it's touching on the theme that you mentioned before, that I guess the scale or the purview of this community of experts, which is to bring to bear the world's expertise in terms of geospatial on global problems.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm doing a lot of background here for this question. Excuse me for the drama. But as another aspect underpinning or as context for why I'm going to ask you this question, I'm preparing for another episode with Henk van Houten, who's an academic in Holland, who wrote a book called Free the Map. And it's about what's sort of prompted by the flood of migrants from some of the world's poorer countries to Europe, and associated political impacts in Europe. So in 2011, there was a week where I received 2 job offers. One was to volunteer for Engineers Without Borders Australia in Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, for a local non-government organization advocating on behalf of those in urban poor communities suffering the threat of eviction. The same week, I was offered a job, a plum job in Australia's oil and gas industry, fly in, fly out role for Santos, doubling the size of a gas field and all of that, right? I chose the former to go and spend the better part of a year volunteering in Cambodia. Again, I'm doing a lot in terms of a lead up to this question, but I'm finally getting to the point. So this volunteering role was to use geospatial to illustrate the challenges for those living in these urban poor communities who were being evicted, sort of picked off one community by community over a 20-year period as part of developing the city and for the benefit of rich property owners. So that was my first contact as a man, a white man from Australia, growing up with a life of privilege, yeah, with tertiary education and all of the advantages that I have, coming to this country where people genuinely were not so fortunate. And the specific type of misfortune was that they did not have security of tenureship, and they could be sent away tens of kilometers away to a plot of land that had no economic potential, and the government essentially dispensed of them, washed its hands, and went on with life. So that was my first awareness of this issue of poorer people having a lack of security over their access to land. Bringing things forward, NEOM is a large nation-building project in Tabuk province in Saudi Arabia. There's a city called The Line, which is supposed to be 170 kilometers long in that province. However, that project also involved displacement of tribal landowners, or at least I can say people who have less privilege. And because of that lower degree of privilege and power, had their land was taken away. In a way, one might say, for the benefit of definitely the ruling class in that country, but possibly tangentially the benefit of those Western companies delivering on that project. So I've drawn a bit of a line over a few years across a few countries about an issue that's also being written about by this Dutch academic, where we have this global issue of flows of people from less fortunate countries, people who don't have as much power, and as part of that, don't have as strong of a claim on their land as more powerful people. So it would be interesting to hear about if this topic ever comes up in the discussions of this community of experts.
I have not heard that particular topic addressed in that way. There is a recognition of the inequity that exists. And so part of the reason why some of these frameworks are there is one, so that it can be identified whether this is inequities through the whole matter as the migration issue that you've just indicated, whether it is the whole matter
I did raise two issues there.
Right,
I hope
of
somehow
land tenure that you also mentioned, because there is a land management grouping or framework that really speaks to how some of these things can address. So from that perspective, at that level, that is being spoken of. However, taking some of what you have said, there are other, I know that within the private sector network, whether it's through the foundation arms of some of the private sector, some of these things are being addressed. I think of organizations that have some of persons in the private sector serving on it, like Cadastre. That is an organization that is addressing this whole matter in terms of land tenure and ownership. And it's a real matter. I also think of other organizations like North Star GIS that is really looking at the things through a social justice lens. And those are some organizations that I point to. I mean, one of the things, WGIC, which is a World Geospatial Industry Council, I too am a member of that council. I lead what is called the DEI committee, diversity, equity, and inclusion, because you did start out by painting the color of our industry, and it is predominantly white males in gray suits. Let's be real about it. And so that's another area that I'm very passionate about. And so we have to do something to start changing that, because sometimes when you do not have the persons, whether it is in the UN structure or in the company structure that is representative of our industry sitting at the table, then these things can be missed. And so that's one of the reasons why I try to be one of the voices that represent the Caribbean, but also Black women in this industry, because I feel that our industry, geography doesn't dictate destiny, or shouldn't, but it often does. And when we look at our industry, we're trying to use geography to solve some of the challenges. And so we're dealing with a wide cross section. We're dealing with the entire world. And so our industry needs to be a representative of the entire world. At this point in time, it is not. And so how do we get to the point where it is representative? And so that's another fight that we have to continue to push for. And I think until we're able to address that, some of what you speak about will not be addressed. But yes, there are those of us who sit either as observers or who interface with folks in the committee of experts, and we speak to the fact that some of these issues have to be addressed. So yes, it may come up not on the main agenda at this point in time, but it is happening inside conversations. It is happening inside events. And I'm hoping that one day it will get to the main stage, and it will not just be about frameworks, but it will actually be, how do we look at solving that? And I think the only place that I'm seeing it being looked at right now is through the lens of climate justice, because the Climate Action Committee is looking at some of those things, which means that because it's so cross-cutting, it will inevitably come up.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Quite simply, as the sea level rises, people in coastal communities may have less land, quite straightforwardly. So you mentioned that there is some land ownership or cadastre related UN body. Did I get that right?
No, so it's not a body. It's so the body that the what I mentioned was the land information. There has been a working group, and they've also created some framework. So that there was a framework that speaks to the whole matter of land as well. So that is also there. Cadastre that I mentioned is a separate foundation, and they literally is a foundation. They look at land and land related issues for persons in underserved communities. That's a totally different organization. Might be good to have a chat with them at some point.
I was about to say that. Yes. So maybe
can certainly do a connect.
Excellent. So after we finish recording, I'd love to get that handoff, because I'd like to see how far I can take this. Maybe at least to flag a conversation, if I am so lucky as to be able to schedule an episode with this next body. Something that immediately springs to mind about especially tribal claims to land is that it's almost the very opposite of someone wearing a gray suit with a tie and a theodolite defining to the millimeter where the property boundary goes. There is perhaps a different way of signifying a meaningful connection to land that nevertheless is still as much of a valid claim to the land as one with a property deed. So anyway, I look forward to taking that further in another
I will definitely give you a handoff. And the person I'm thinking of is Albert Momo, and he's also familiar with the UN system, and he's the chair of Cadastre at the moment.
Perfect. All right. I feel like getting a bit of a mission going here with this podcast. So
I like that.
Valrie, that's concludes my set of questions. And I just want to say again, it's so meaningful to have the chance to, because I've been that white man in a gray suit. I've worked for so many of these publicly traded companies. I've got to the team leader stage. Don't get me wrong, especially with my last team leader role, I engaged in that with a lot of conviction, and I felt that I made a lot of progress for my team. It's incredibly meaningful work, but that's not to say, it's so nice to hear that I can engage in equally meaningful work with perhaps an even broader impact with the sort of context that you've described for us here. So thanks very much.
Thank you for having me. And I just want to say that, it takes all of us. So we need everybody. We just need to make sure that it is not just one set that is there. So we need to get others to the table. And there's so many persons who are doing great work. And so we applaud those work. And we have the persons who are advocating to get others to the table. So we continue to say, please continue to do that. And we thank you for doing that. And we look forward to when our industry will be more equitable, and it will also contribute to the kind of just and equitable world that we are all longing for.